November 1948. Tempelhof Airport, the American sector of Berlin. Fog. Visibility around 400 meters. Sleet. Every 3 minutes, a 4-engine C-54 Skymaster drops out of the clouds. Heavy, laden, with 10 tons of coal in its belly. It comes in on final approach over the rooftops of residential blocks. The clearance between the wingtips and the chimney stacks is close enough that you could make out the rivets on the fuselage from a balcony. Gear down, engines throttled back.
Police intervened,
Touchdown.
pushing the Soviets away,
Roll out.
preventing a massacre.
Turn onto the taxiway.
Berlin's parliament.
No sooner has one aircraft landed than the next is already on the glide slope. Then another behind it. And another. Around the clock, 7 days a week, whatever the weather. This is not war, not bombing, not an airborne assault. This is supply. 2.5 million people are living in a city cut off from the
Some
world.
enterprising pilots started
All around
dropping
it
chocolate
lies the
bars,
Soviet
attached
occupation
little
zone.
homemade parachutes to German
Every
children.
road is blocked. The rail lines are closed. Barges sit motionless on the canals. The electricity supply from the eastern zone has been cut. The Soviet Union has around 300,000 troops in East Germany, tanks, artillery, ground attack aircraft. The Western Allies have several thousand in Berlin, not even a full division, a token garrison. In purely military terms, the situation is hopeless. If Moscow decides to march in, it takes West Berlin within 24 hours. Defense is out of the question. But Moscow has no intention of fighting.
Ground crew
Moscow
from World War
wants
II.
to squeeze.
The record time for
quietly,
unloading.
methodically, without firing a single shot. Cut off the supply lines and wait. Within a month, Berliners will exhaust their food stocks. Within 2, the coal will be gone. The city will freeze and starve. The Western Allies will face the arithmetic, realize that feeding a major city is impossible, and leave. Voluntarily,
With inefficient use of aircraft
with
and
apologies.
crews. Major General William
The plan
H.
is
Tunner,
logical,
who had led the
calculated,
airlift over the Himalayas
almost
and World
flawless. Almost. Because it fails to account for one variable: air transport.
aircraft
The
took off
idea
every
of
4
supplying
minutes,
a city
flying
of
in
more than
patterns
2
on a
million
loop into
people
West Berlin
entirely by
and back.
air seemed absurd. Even those who proposed it did not believe it could last. A stopgap measure, something to hold the line while the diplomats reached a deal.
1,000 tons a day, still
the
too little.
diplomats did
The
not
Allied
reach a
effort was
deal.
disorganized, with
Berlin needs a minimum of 4,500 tons of supplies every day. Flour, potatoes, tinned goods, dried milk, medicines, and the heaviest item of all, coal. 1,500 tons of coal every single day. Because Berlin is not Tashkent.
British
Winter
short
begins here
Sunderland
in
flying
October,
boats also joined
and
in,
without heating,
landing
it
on
is
the Havel River
unsurvivable.
near Gottal.
The
Aircraft
largest
took
military transport aircraft the Western Allies had, the C-54, carried 10 tons. That means a minimum of 450 flights per day. One aircraft every 3 minutes, without a single gap.
C-54s
No one in the
were
history of
arriving in
aviation had
numbers.
come anywhere
The
near
Americans and
figures
British
like that.
used separate air corridors.
The aerial resupply of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942? The Luftwaffe was delivering between 100 and 150 tons a day to Paulus's Sixth Army,
Berlin, and
against a
separate
minimum
command
requirement
system.
of 500.
British
That failure was one of the reasons for the catastrophe. The Western Allies were proposing to move dozens of times more than that, every day, for months on end. There are details that refuse to sink in until you start doing the sums. A single round trip from a base in West Germany to Berlin takes
By
3
the
to
second
4
week, the
hours.
Airlift was managing 1,000
One
tons.
aircraft can manage 2 or 3 sorties in a day. That means you need 150 to 200 aircraft in the air simultaneously. Not on paper, not held in reserve, but actually flying. Then there are the airfields. West Berlin has 2, Tempelhof in the American sector and Gatow in the British sector. 2 airfields for 450 landings a day. The equivalent of funneling the entire freight flow from Odessa to Murmansk through a
New
single
regulations were
crossroads.
issued after a day of accidents
And one
on
more
the 13th
detail.
of
There are 3 air corridors, narrow lanes, each 30 kilometers wide. Everything outside them is Soviet airspace. Stray outside a corridor, and technically that is a violation, and Soviet fighters are entitled to intercept. 3 corridors, 2 runways,
planners calculated
450
they could
flights.
amass 447
It reads like a textbook
for the
problem
Berlin
with no
operation.
solution. The Berlin Airlift ran from June 26, 1948 to September 30, 1949. More than 15 months. Around 278,000 sorties. 2.3 million tons of cargo. Around 100 people killed. Pilots, flight engineers, and ground personnel. It is generally regarded as a triumph, a victory of logistics, a show of strength without a shot fired. But what is rarely told is that the first 3 weeks were chaos. There were not enough aircraft.
Airports.
The
The
ones
answer was
available
the
were aging
C-54
C-47
Skymaster.
Dakotas,
The US
carrying 3.5 tons rather than 10. Pilots were running on no sleep. There was no functioning air traffic control. In those early days, deliveries ran at around 80 tons a day. 80 tons. Less than 2% of what the city needed. How 2% became 100 is not a story about heroism, and it is not about the machines. It is a story about a system, about a man who looked at that chaos and saw a conveyor belt, about how a cargo aircraft became a substitute for a railway, not because it was better, but because there was no other option. And about a question that underlies everything.
and 40
Was the Berlin
larger
Airlift
Avro
a
Yorks,
humanitarian
the latter with a
operation?
10-ton payload.
Or the most
British-
audacious bluff of the Cold War? One that could have ended in a third world war. To understand why a great city found itself trapped, we need to go back 3 years, to May 1945.
The US had 565
Berlin in May
around the world.
1945
Planners
was not a
calculate-
city. It was ruins with people living in them. Of the roughly 1.5 million dwellings that had existed before the war, around a third had been destroyed or severely damaged. Whole neighborhoods had virtually ceased to exist. Water came from standpipes. The sewers were wrecked.
Calories per
Electricity was
adult.
intermittent.
Each day,
German women were clearing the rubble with their bare hands, the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Into this city marched 4 victorious armies, Soviet, American, British, and French. Berlin was divided into sectors. The eastern part went to the Soviets, the western
what was
part to
required.
the Allies.
the RAF
On paper, it was straightforward, joint administration through the Allied Control Council. In practice, it was a disaster. Berlin lay 160 kilometers from the nearest point of the Western occupation zones. The city was an
Each
island
day,
in the middle of
West Berlin would
Soviet-controlled
need
territory.
646 tons
When
of
the
wheat
Allies
and
had
flour.
negotiated the division at Yalta and Potsdam, the air corridors were formally documented. 3 lanes, each 30 kilometers wide. But the overland routes were left on the basis of verbal agreement alone. There was no formal agreement on transit rights. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor
May,
of Germany,
commander of US
would
Air
later
Forces in
acknowledge
Europe,
this as a fatal error. While relations remained civil, convoys and trains ran without incident. But by 1947, a crisis was taking shape. March 1947 brought the Truman Doctrine, the policy of containing communism. June brought the Marshall Plan,
The RAF
offering
was
economic
already running
aid to
a
Europe,
small-scale
which
airlift
the
to British
USSR
garrison.
flatly rejected, and pressured Poland and Czechoslovakia to reject as well. Moscow saw it as tying Europe to the dollar and a loss of control. Germany lay at the center of the fault line. The Western Allies were moving towards establishing an economically strong West German state. For the Soviet Union, a rearmed West Germany represented an unacceptable threat. In January 1948, the first road checks began. Soviet patrols started detaining Western convoys on formal pretexts. On March 20th, Marshal Sokolovsky walked out of a meeting of the Allied Control Council.
Carry such a tonnage,
Joint administration
the
of
US
Berlin
had 96
had collapsed.
C-47.
On June 20th, 1948, the Western Allies carried out a currency reform. The devalued Reichsmark was replaced by the Deutschmark. The
5,000.
exchange rate for the public started at 1-to-1 for small amounts, while larger savings were converted at 10-to-1. The reform was designed to kick-start the Western
Sky
economy,
trains or
but
Dakotas
it threatened
in Europe,
to flood the
each
Soviet
capable
zone
of carrying
with
300
worthless old Reichsmarks. On June 23rd, Moscow introduced the Eastmark and demanded it become the sole currency across the whole of Berlin. The Western Allies refused and extended the Deutschmark to West Berlin. For Moscow, this was the final pretext.
Could also deliver
At 1:15 in the morning of June 24th,
of what was
Soviet forces closed every overland route. The autobahn was blocked. The railway was shut down for maintenance. The barges stopped. The electricity supply was cut. That morning, Berliners woke up in an isolated city. Food reserves stood at 36 days, coal at 45. General Clay demanded that a convoy of lorries
The RAF could
backed by
expand
tanks
quickly, flying
be sent
in fresh
to force
aircraft
its
from
way
England.
through. Washington refused outright. There would be no Third World War. Instead, it was decided to use the air corridors that existed on paper. Clay looked at the tonnage calculations and did not believe the operation could succeed. But the order was given. On
The
June
RAF
26,
reported it could also
1948,
deliver
the first 32 C-47 transports took off from Wiesbaden Air Base. Operation Vittles had begun. The early days of Operation Vittles were sheer chaos. The aging transports carried too little cargo, meaning thousands of sorties were needed to supply Berlin. Handling that volume at just 2 airfields was physically impossible. In those first days, deliveries ran at a meager 80 tons a day. By the end of the first week, they had reached 500, but for a city of that size, it was a drop in the ocean. Pilots were flying themselves into the ground. There was no coherent schedule. Aircraft requested landing clearance individually and circled over the city for long stretches, burning fuel. Unloading was done by
police
hand.
intervened,
Sacks
pushing
were
the
carried on
Soviets
people's
away,
backs.
preventing a
Coal
massacre.
was shoveled.
Berlin's
A
parliament
single aircraft could occupy the runway for up to an hour and a half. In Moscow, all of this was watched without undue alarm. The reasoning was simple. A supply line running through such a narrow corridor and already pushed to its limits would sooner or later break down. The Kremlin was giving the Allies 2 months at most. Then, at the end of July, Major General William H. Tunner flew into
pilots
Wiesbaden.
started dropping chocolate
He was not
bars,
a combat
attached little
commander.
homemade parachutes
His
to German
specialty
children
was logistics. During the war, it had been Tunner who organized the extraordinarily complex airlift from India to China over the Himalayas, increasing the volume of supplies delivered tenfold. And he had achieved that not through heroism, but through rigorous system. On August 13th came what would later be called Black Friday. In foul weather, a bottleneck developed over Tempelhof. One aircraft overran onto the grass, another burst a tire on landing, and a third went around. 12 more aircraft were circling in the fog with nearly empty tanks. Tunner, who was aboard one of them, assessed the situation and issued the order.
The record time for unloading.
Everyone returned to base immediately. Losing the cargo was the lesser evil compared to losing control of the airspace. Over the next 2 weeks, Tunner rebuilt the operation from the ground up. He introduced a strict one-approach rule. If you missed the runway, you turned around and flew back to base. There were no go-arounds because a single aircraft in the circuit blocked the approach for 5 others.
Use of aircraft and crews.
In the sky above, a genuine aerial conveyor belt took shape.
Airlift over the Himalayas and
aircraft followed one another at precisely 3-minute intervals, maintaining strictly assigned altitudes and airspeeds. To prevent collisions, the corridors were made one way.
Every 4 minutes, flying in patterns on
the
a
2
loop
outer
West
routes
Berlin
carried traffic into Berlin only. The central route was used exclusively for the return flight west. Strictly, and without exception, ground stops were turned into racing pit stops.
But the Allied effort was disorganized.
Pilots were forbidden to leave their cockpits. While German workers unloaded coal and flour, the crew were handed hot food and a fresh weather briefing directly through the cockpit door. The whole process took no more than half an hour, after which the aircraft was back in the air. At the same time, the older, smaller aircraft were progressively replaced en masse by heavier, higher-capacity types. By September, the daily tonnage had exceeded 4,000 tons. Berlin had stopped going hungry. In Moscow, it was becoming clear that their calculations had gone wrong. But winter lay ahead.
C-54s were arriving in numbers.
Icing,
the Americans
zero
and British
visibility.
used separate air corridors.
Tunner's finely tuned conveyor belt could only function on one condition: that the aircraft were actually able to land. The hardest problem the airlift faced was not flour.
And a separate command system.
The hardest problem was coal. 1,500 tons every day, 1/3 of the entire cargo flow. Coal was needed for power stations, for heating residential districts, and for factories. Without it, Berlin was not merely condemned to hunger. It faced becoming a dead city. And this heaviest of cargoes had to be transported by air in ordinary sacks. Coal dust became the true curse of the operation. It got into everything: instrument panels, engines, oxygen masks. It packed itself between fuselage frames, settled on control linkages, and choked filters solid. After every flight, the aircraft had to be cleaned thoroughly. Ground crews literally blew out the fuselage with compressed air. Eventually, a number of aircraft were assigned exclusively to coal runs, and they flew with a dense black crust lining their walls. The pilots themselves joked that after landing, they looked like miners coming off a hard shift. Faces, hands, and uniforms were coated in a thick layer of grime. Unloading coal on the ground was back-breaking work. 10 tons of sacks had to be shifted by hand. German loaders, former soldiers and unemployed men, formed a chain and for hours passed the sacks from the cargo hatch into the beds of lorries. Within that picture lay a remarkable detail. Only 3 years earlier, those same Germans and Americans had been fighting a war of annihilation. Tempelhof had been one of the defining symbols of Nazi aviation. And now, yesterday's enemies were working side by side simply to keep the city alive through the winter. The blockade had made them allies. By August 1948, it was clear that 2 airfields were desperately insufficient. The runways at Tempelhof and Gatow were breaking up under the weight of heavy aircraft. A third site was needed. There was no suitable area in the French sector of Berlin, but a flat stretch of land was found near Tegel, a former artillery range. The decision was taken immediately. Build an airfield from scratch with one of the longest runways in Europe. The deadline was just 3 months. Construction equipment was almost non-existent, but 19,000 Berliners volunteered to work, most of them women. Instead of wages, they received food rations. The rubble for the runway foundation came directly from the city's ruins. Broken bricks and chunks of concrete were pressed into service. Berlin was literally building its own salvation out of its own wreckage.
40 larger Avro Yorks,
90 days later,
10-ton
Tegel
payload.
received its first aircraft. There was, however, an unexpected obstacle. A tall Soviet radio mast stood directly on the final approach path. The French military requested its removal twice, but Moscow refused both times. On the third occasion, the French did not ask.
Around the world.
Their engineers simply demolished the structure, clearing the glide slope. With Tegel open, the airlift's capacity increased by 40% at a stroke. Against that backdrop of hard-edged logistics, a story emerged that would change the image of the operation forever. In July 1948, a young American pilot named Gail Halvorsen was standing at the perimeter fence at Tempelhof Airfield. Local children came up to him. Halvorsen rummaged through his pockets, found his last 2 sticks of chewing gum, and passed them through the wire. The children divided them carefully between themselves, and those who received nothing simply smelled the wrappers. Not one of them begged.
The RAF.
A slight young girl said quietly in English, "Just don't stop flying. If you keep flying, we'll manage. If you stop, they'll take us." Deeply moved, Halvorsen promised that next time he would drop sweets for them from the sky. And so that the children would recognize his aircraft, he promised to rock his wings on the approach. The following day, he tied chocolate and sweets to makeshift parachutes fashioned from handkerchiefs and dropped them through the signal hatch. Within a week, all of Berlin knew of the Candy Pilot, and the children had nicknamed him Uncle Wiggly Wings. Before long, other crews joined in. American factories began sending sweets by the ton. The command, which had initially threatened a court-martial for breaching regulations, quickly grasped that this was the finest piece of humanitarian propaganda in history and gave the operation official approval. Over the course of the entire airlift, more than 20 tons of sweets were dropped on Berlin. It was a beautiful, remarkably human detail. But the winter of 1948 that was now closing in was not about sweets. It was about hard survival. November 20th, 1948. Tempelhof closed. Gatow closed.
His calculations on a minimum
Tegel
daily
closed
ration
as well.
of 1,900.
A fog had settled over the city, thick as milk. Visibility below 100 meters, cloud pressed down to the very ground. There was nowhere to land. Tunner's perfect conveyor system had ground to a halt.
To carry such a
Aircraft
tonnage,
were not flying,
the US had 96
and Berlin was receiving nothing
C-47.
at all. November proved the darkest month of the entire operation. Out of 30 days, the crews were barely able to fly properly
in total,
on half of them.
5,000.
The rest of the time brought icing, snow, and endless fog. Daily delivery volumes collapsed. On some days, the airfields accepted no more than 1,500 tons of cargo,
each capable of
and
carrying
on others, nothing whatsoever. The city began living hand to mouth, drawing down whatever had not been distributed the day before. Electricity was rationed severely. Power was available for only 4 hours a day, in 2 short blocks of 2 hours each, morning and evening. For the rest of the time, this great metropolis sank into absolute darkness.
Of what was required.
People used candles and paraffin lamps, but before long, even those ran out too. Coal was issued on ration cards, just 25 kilograms per family per week. To heat a freezing flat, at least twice that amount was needed. People turned to burning furniture, wooden fences, and park benches. Residents began felling trees and digging out stumps in the
RAF could expand
Berlin's
quickly,
Central
flying
Park,
in fresh aircraft
which
from
by
England.
spring had been stripped completely bare. Meanwhile, rations remained meager. Heavy gray bread, tinned meat, and potato reconstituted from powder. It was not starvation outright, but a grinding, chronic undernourishment. At this critical moment, Ernst Reuter, Berlin's elected mayor, played a decisive role.
Reported it could also deliver.
Moscow despised him because he had lived in Soviet Russia during the 1920s and knew the system from the inside. He could not be intimidated or deceived. Back in September, Reuter had gathered 300,000 Berliners among the ruins of the Reichstag and issued a desperate appeal to the world. Peoples of the world, look upon this city. He understood that if the West faltered, the winter would simply finish Berlin off. Meanwhile, a hidden war of nerves was being waged within the narrow air corridors. Soviet fighters regularly simulated attacks, sweeping past at high speed in dangerously close proximity to the heavy American transports. At night, pilots were blinded by powerful anti-aircraft searchlights at the precise moment of their final approach.
Police intervened,
Barrage
pushing the
balloons
Soviets
with
away,
steel cables
preventing a
appeared,
massacre.
apparently by
Berlin's
accident,
parliament
in the clouds. Moscow was openly walking a fine line, but it did not cross it. Shooting down an aircraft meant starting a war, and Stalin was not ready for that. The United States already possessed atomic weapons. Not a single transport aircraft was shot down during the entire blockade, but the strain on aircrew was at breaking point. People were dying because of extreme fatigue,
Some enterprising
night
pilots
fog,
started
and
dropping
icing.
chocolate bars attached to little
Over the
homemade
15 months of the
parachutes to German
airlift,
children.
the Allies lost dozens of pilots and ground workers. Every crash meant not only the death of a crew, but the loss of a precious aircraft, and with it, 30 fewer tons of coal for the city's freezing districts. January and February marked the peak of the ordeal. If bad weather brought the conveyor system to a standstill for a single day, the following day, they had to carry double the normal load, which seemed impossible. The city was visibly wasting away. Adults lost weight before your eyes, and children were developing vitamin deficiencies. At the same time, the Soviet administration mounted an intensive propaganda
The
campaign,
record time for unloading
offering West Berliners the chance to transfer to the supply system in the Eastern Zone. Full rations, coal, and unrestricted electricity were promised. But out of 2.5 million people, only around 4% took up the offer. 96% of Berliners deliberately chose to remain in the cold and the dark. For them, the greatest incentive to hold on was the unbroken drone
inefficient
of
use
engines
of aircraft
overhead.
and crews. Major
Aircraft
General
were
William
flying
H.
every
Tunner,
3
who had led
minutes,
the hump
day
airlift
and
over
night.
the Himalayas and world
Proof that the world had not abandoned them. The deep rumble of C-54 Skymaster engines above the rooftops had become the defining
Aircraft
sound of
took off
hope
every
for
4
Berlin.
minutes, flying in patterns
By
on a
March
loop into West
1949,
Berlin and back.
the harsh winter had begun to retreat. The fog lifted, the days grew longer, and the conveyor system was running at full capacity. It was then
1,000
that
tons a
General
day,
Tunner
still
resolved
too
to prove
little.
to
The
Moscow
Allied effort
that
was
his
disorganized,
logistics system
with
was capable of the impossible. At noon on April 16, 1949, on the eve of Easter, General Tunner gave the order to push men and machines to their absolute limit. Every serviceable aircraft was put into the air, and air traffic controllers and unloading crews were rotated
British
on
short
2-hour
Sunderland flying
shifts.
boats also joined in.
This
landing on the
24-hour
Havel River
demonstration
near
of
Gotha.
strength passed
Aircraft
into
took off.
history as the Easter Parade. Tunner wanted to prove to Moscow that the airlift conveyor was capable of supplying Berlin not merely adequately, but with an enormous surplus. For 24 hours, the sky was filled with an
C-54s were arriving
unbroken
in
roar.
numbers. The Americans and British used
Transports
separate air
flew the
corridors
corridors
in
at record intervals of less than 2 minutes, and aircraft were landing every 30 seconds on the runways. In that single day, the Allies flew almost
corridors
1,400
into West
sorties,
Berlin, and a
delivering
separate
nearly
command system.
13,000
British-
tons of cargo to the city, 3 times Berlin's daily consumption. Coal sacks flew straight from hatches into the backs of lorries, and despite the furious pace, not a single accident occurred. For the Kremlin, the Easter Parade was the
By the
moment when
second
the
week,
old
the airlift
arithmetic
was managing
finally
1,000
surrendered.
tons.
The blockade had been conceived as a temporary noose that would tighten with the onset of winter. But the airlift had survived the winter, and in the spring it had demonstrated, unmistakably, its capacity for limitless growth. Stalin was a pragmatist, and he understood that continuing the isolation was pointless.
New regulations were
The Western
issued
Allies
after a
had
day of
not simply
accidents on the
refused to
13th of
leave. The blockade had produced the opposite effect, one that Moscow found alarming. Just a fortnight before that record, on April 4, 1949, 12 nations had signed the North Atlantic Treaty,
Planners calculated
bringing
they
NATO
could amass
into existence.
447
Before
for
the Berlin
operation.
crisis, such an alliance had seemed unthinkable. A prosperous Europe had no desire to bind itself to military commitments with the United States. But the blockade had made it plain that Moscow understood only strength, and a formidable defensive alliance had taken shape on the borders of the Soviet Union. In trying to force the Allies out, the Kremlin had also hastened the division of Germany itself. Stalin recognized the geopolitical miscalculation in time and began to back down.
Airports. The
As
answer
early
was
as
the
January,
C-54
in an
Skymaster.
interview with the American
US
press, he had conspicuously forgotten to mention the currency dispute over the Deutschmark, the issue that had formally started the conflict. Diplomats read the signal, and secret negotiations began behind the scenes at the United Nations. Moscow desperately tried to save face, presenting the lifting of the sanctions as a goodwill gesture in exchange for the convening of a ministerial conference. On May 12, 1949, at 1:15 in the morning, at precisely the same minute that the blockade had begun, Soviet
and 40
forces
larger
raised the
Avro
barriers
Yorks,
on the roads.
the latter with a 10-ton
The
payload.
autobahns and
British-
railway lines were open again. The first to enter the city were a British military convoy and trains loaded with flour. But the exhausted Berliners held no celebrations and fired no salutes. People simply stood for hours along the
US had
roadsides,
565
silently
around the
watching
world.
the endless
Planners
columns of
calculate-
lorries. After 11 months of survival in the dark, the city had nothing left for rejoicing. Remarkably, even after the roads reopened, Tunner's air conveyor did not stop. The aircraft kept flying right through to the end of September. The general placed no trust in
Calories
verbal
per
assurances and
Each
pragmatically set about building up a protected strategic reserve of food and fuel in West Berlin against the possibility of a renewed blockade. The operation concluded in the autumn, finally fixing the contours of a new political reality. On 23 May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was established in the West.
The
And in
RAF
October, the German Democratic Republic came into being in the East. A diplomatic rupture had become a historical fact with which the world would live for the next 40 years. And 12 years later still, a concrete wall
Each
would be
day,
built
West Berlin
along
would
that
need
very line.
646 tons of wheat
The
and
final
flour.
figures for this extraordinary airlift are staggering. More than 277,000 sorties and upwards of 2.3 million tons of cargo delivered. 1.5 million tons of that total was ordinary
May,
coal.
commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe,
This triumph of logistics cost the Allies an enormous sum of money and claimed the lives of dozens of aircrew and ground workers. Those figures remain in the archives forever. But behind them stands the central question that transforms the
RAF was
Berlin
already
drama
running
into
a
something far
small-scale
greater
airlift to
than
the
merely a
British
successful
garrison.
episode of the Cold War. Tempelhof closed in October 2008. The last aircraft lifted from the runway, and silence fell. In a referendum, Berliners voted that the legendary airfield at the very heart of their city was no longer
based his
needed.
calculations on a minimum daily
Today,
ration
a
of
vast public
1,900
park stretches across what was once the airfield. Locals jog along the old taxiways, hold picnics on the former aircraft stands, and fly kites where heavy Skymasters once touched down. The enormous terminal building itself has become a historic monument, with its monumental semicircular facade built in Hitler's time. At the airport entrance rises a memorial, 3 curved concrete fins sweeping sharply into the sky. They represent the 3 air corridors that saved the city. Locals call this memorial the Hunger Clause. At its base are inscribed the names of more than 70 people, pilots, mechanics, and loaders, who did not come home from their flights. Children on scooters roll past them today, and few people stop
a
to
ground
read the
crew
lists.
from World War II.
The
The
Berlin
record
airlift
time for
passed into
unloading-
history as an unqualified triumph. But the further that era recedes, the harder it becomes to answer the question, a victory over what exactly? Over the blockade? Unquestionably. The city held out, and the isolation failed. Over the Soviet Union? Not in any formal sense. Moscow lifted the barriers through a diplomatic maneuver, not a capitulation.
With inefficient use of
Perhaps
aircraft and
it was a
crews.
victory over
Major
common
General
sense
William
itself.
H. Tunner, who had led
Because
the
the
Hump
idea of
airlifts over
supplying the
Himalayas in
metropolis
World-
exclusively by air seemed like absolute madness. And it remained madness, even though it worked. General Tunner's greatest
Aircraft took off
achievement
every
was not
4
simply
minutes,
that he
flying
moved
in
millions
patterns
of tons
on a
of
loop into
cargo.
West Berlin and
He
back.
invented an entirely new logistical system. He took chaos and turned it into a flawless conveyor belt. Tunner imposed
1,000
rigid discipline
tons
on
a
the
day,
skies,
still too little.
precise,
But the Allied
minute-by-minute
effort was
intervals,
disorganized, with
a ban on go-arounds, and lightning-fast pit stops on the ground, during which pilots never even left their cockpits. That revolutionary approach was later adopted the world over. When you see a vast sorting center today distributing millions of parcels without a hitch, or a port terminal unloading a container ship in a matter of hours,
British
know that the
short-Sunderland
Tunner
flying
system
boats
lies
also
at the
joined
foundation
in,
of it
landing
all.
on the Havel River near Gatow.
The airlift proved what had
Aircraft took
seemed
off-
abstract before 1948. Logistics is a fully fledged strategic weapon. A few hundred unarmed transport aircraft rendered the presence of a 300,000-strong Soviet force around Berlin simply pointless.
C-54s
The Allies got around the attempt to cut off the city without fighting a single engagement. But what if that fragile plan had failed? If that winter had been harsher still, the fog thicker, and Washington simply had not had enough aircraft.
And a separate command
General
system.
Lucius D. Clay believed to the end of his days that the airlift was an extreme risk and that the Allies should have forced the roads open with tanks. He was convinced that Stalin read the flour-laden aircraft as a sign of weakness.
By the
Clay
second week,
was
the
wrong,
airlift was managing
but
to
history
1,000 tons.
could have turned out differently. Had Moscow decided to press the matter to its conclusion and shoot down even a handful of aircraft, the world would have stood on the brink of a third world war. The airlift held, not because it was invulnerable, but because neither side ultimately chose to put it to the test with weapons. It was a
New
grand
regulations
bluff
were issued
against a
after a
bluff,
day of accidents
in
on
which
the 13th of
aircraft
August.
loaded with coal outplayed the tanks lined up along the roadsides. The most peaceful response to the crisis proved the most dangerous, because had it failed, the Allies had nowhere left to retreat. The heroes of that drama
They
left
could
the
amass
stage quietly.
447
Gail
for the Berlin
Halvorsen,
operation.
the legendary candy bomber himself, lived to 101, passing away in February 2022. Well into old age, he would fly back to Berlin, where elderly German women, tears in their eyes, told him they had caught his little parachutes as children. General Tunner died in 1983, leaving the world a functioning global air transport system. Mayor Ernst Reuter, who had given everything to the fight for the city, died of a heart attack just 4 years after the blockade was
Skymaster.
lifted. He was 59. So what was the Berlin airlift? A rescue operation? A geopolitical bluff? Or a pure experiment? In truth, all three at once. In that situation, there were simply no good, safe options. Moving in with tanks meant starting a war. Abandoning Berlin meant losing Europe. A third path was chosen, a logistical act of madness in which, at first, nobody believed. The risk was enormous, and millions of lives were at
larger
stake.
Avro Yorks,
To call it a reckless gamble would be unfair. To call it simple heroism would be too easy. It was a great victory won by sheer nerve, not military might. And it was possible only because, at the most critical moment, neither superpower actually wanted a major
around
war.
The world. Planners
Perhaps that is the central lesson of the Berlin airlift. Even at the epicenter of a frozen standoff, if neither side wants to open fire, a way out can always be found. However strange, however extraordinarily difficult, however close to the edge of the absurd. A way out in which ordinary transport aircraft outplay tanks forever. Do you think that risk was justified? Or should the Allies really have acted with more force, as General Clay proposed? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to debate it. And do subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new, in-depth explorations of history, where we strip away the grand slogans and leave only the facts.
The RAF.
See you in the next episode.